Do you know what it was, idolater? Do you know what caused the strong scions of my house to turn from the Imperium? It was nothing. No, you weren't there, neither was I, but our memories are clear, both mine and Corifex's. I know the deeds my forebears carried out in the name of Terra's greed, for they never ceased to tell me. There was nothing left of our Imperium to turn from. Lies, weakness, and Terra's lick-spittle scribes. It had already rotted from within. Fealty is everything. Your kind understand this almost as well as Corifex and I do. Terra broke its bond the day it abandoned the strong, and so became nothing. That is what we turned from. When House Lucaris spent the knee beneath Mordor Prime's storms, it was for conquest. Do you hear? Corifex remembers. And in the interminable moments between each kill, the whispers in the throne tell me. Those whispers that doubted. Echoes of dissenting nobles held within Corifex. They are no more. Those that remain tell me they were frail, unworthy of us, of what we will become. They have been ever louder since the great rift tore its glorious path across the stars. They have spoken to me of power. They have shouted of this moment, screamed until I bled in understanding, until I realized we were not being asked to change. We conquer now as we have always done, and as we always will. It is our vow to ourselves, unbroken since the days when Terra seethed with 1,000 yelping monarchs. Those days are here again. Let fools dash themselves against my walls. Let the weak bleed and whimper beneath my gaze. The galaxy will bend its knee to us this time. Lord Wesk, magnate of House Lucaris, and pilot of the Knight Despoiler Corifex. Games Workshop, Warhammer 40k, Psychic Awakening, Engine War. Twisted by savage psychic storms in the aftermath of the Great Rift's emergence, the galaxy has become a darker place. Its sectors and systems are more isolated, and failed designs are able to coalesce in neglected regions. On the nightmarish industrial world of Audax, a confluence of prideful ambition leads to war. The vast forces of the Imperium cannot be everywhere, even coordinated and commanded by the champions of humanity, and made up of billions of courageous warriors. The Imperium's fleets and armies are stretched to breaking point. The number of systems left to fend for themselves, forgotten, abandoned, or simply unreachable, grows daily. Within such environs, the Imperium's enemies grow strong, and even its allies feel the constraints of their oaths loosen. The smog-shrouded planet of Audax is one such hidden blight, a fallen forge world, severed from Martian scrutiny and now stalked by Chaos Knights. The corrupted forges of this forgotten outpost of the machine god are fueled by the psychic emanations of techno-sorcery. The titanically cruel engines of the Chaos Knights and the fallen nobles who pilot them aim to use this malefic power to gouge another empiric rift through the Imperium. Others have witnessed the warped taint spilling from the Cicatrix Maledictum. The Adeptus Mechanicus despair of its illogical and corrupting influence, and a subcult of renegade tech priests seek to test the horrific technology on Audax. The august Imperial Knights, meanwhile, are drawn to the planet by prophecy, yet revile the foul sorcery the warp begets. Both are willing to go to any lengths to push back the growing psychic tide. Conceits and manias are converging on Audax, risking damnation in numbers enough to draw the attention of the Chaos God's demonic servants. Opportunity exists, so the demons promise, for those with the will to act. The Tide of Power. When the Great Rift first split the galaxy and fractured the Imperium, few could have foreseen that beyond the initial devastation, a flood of psychic power would flow from it. From every warp storm, the Imperium's corrupting influence seeped out, tainting everything with malignancy and challenging the supremacy of logic. On Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus felt its influence waning. It feared the loss of valuable resources and holy technologies. Most of all, it feared the risk of secession, of outposts whose loyalty to the Red Planet was already tenuous, using isolation as a pretext to declare independence. To stave off some heresy, Mars reassigned many of its exploratory expeditions as reclamation fleets. They would recontact the Adeptus Mechanicus' worlds, reminding them, by force if necessary, of their duty to Mars. Many Forge worlds sent out fleets of their own, but none could match those of Mars in size or scope. Magos Zu Cawl departed Mars in command of one of its 3 reclamation fleets, destined for Segmentum Tempestus. The fleet made slow progress, buffeted by warp storms from one Forge world to the next, with every ship suffering losses to its astropathic core and bonded navigators. Mars maintained transgenerational contracts with the finest navigator houses in the Imperium, yet here were their scions. As Crawl's closest advisors ranted to the other magi around him, failing to guide the Omnissiah's servants from one divine node of this realm to another. Crawl's fleet made contact with many worlds that owed direct fealty to Mars or declared an affiliation with the Red Planet. In every sector and system, on relay stations and in sunken forged temples, the tank priest Dominus and his fleet's magi beheld the Great Rift's continuing psychic corruption. On the mining world of Gobora, data demons infected the servitor clades, twisting them into abominations that tore apart their masters. In the Archisanctorum, curators were consumed by a scrap code entity, the possessed mechadendrites overriding the Auto-Chapel's reactor's core, destroying the technological relics. On Darius, sentient warp sores bloomed within the Omnissiah's faithful, frail flesh and divine bionics running together like wax. Many of the fleet's magi could not process what they witnessed. Blinded by the loss of irreplaceable artifacts, some mentally discarded the illogical psychic occurrences, proclaiming their impossibility even as they unfolded before their optics. Tech priests went insane trying to categorize the unnatural power they saw manifested by indentured sump scum, declared machine-touched by previously sanctioned psychers who now vomited black fire, or by polymorphic demons crawling from warp tears. The Adeptus Mechanicus' interests, Mars' interests, were suffering, and dogma demanded a reaction. Stoked by the anti-psychic rhetoric that the likes of Dominus Cawl and his circling advisors espoused, the reclamation fleet expended the resources of entire systems as they sought to preserve the Adeptus Mechanicus' power. Ancient technologies were deployed, and field testing of unstable weapons was expanded. The greatest minds of Mars sought to turn back the flood of psychic aberration, using every esoteric force and every ally they possessed. So vital was the future of the Forge worlds that few of the reclamation fleets quested alone. Many were accompanied by troop transports of the Astra Militarum, orbital assault vessels of the Adeptus Sororitas, and war barges of knightly houses carrying their nobles and towering suits. Like the fleets of Mars, many great houses of imperial knights strove to extinguish the corruption pouring from the Great Rift. Few did so more fervently than the Knights of the Parda March, which joined Crawl's reclamation fleet as it entered the Segmentum Tempestus. The Parda March was a heraldic alliance of nobles from many systems. At their head was Baroness Sorden of House Terrin, who nursed a hatred of sorcery and witchcraft, and yet surrounded herself with a coterie of soothsayers, hierophants, and readers of the Emperor's Tarot. Many of the nobles who followed Sorden bore scars dealt by rogue psychers and pyroclastic cults. The monastic sacristans had restored melted shields and twisted armor, but many free blades also carried recently applied memorials, dark reminders of entire lances of their kin brought low by malefic power. Wherever they turned, the reclamation fleets encountered nihilistic slaughter and the blasphemous defilement of the machine god's manifest divinity. Nowhere was this more sickening than in the tainted forms of Chaos Knights. Dread lances of these unhallowed relics emerged from the moors of warp storms to conquer and enslave in greater numbers than ever before. Systems whose communications had been crippled by the Great Rift were preyed upon by the cruel and monstrous engines, even as calamitous empiric manifestation embroiled their defences. With warp storms continuing to dog their endeavours, Crawl's reclamation fleet unearthed picked captures on the devastated industrial world of Sternvale. The images showed city continents strewn with death. Malice-filled Chaos Knights could be seen breaking apart the warded fortifications holding the planet's psychotithe. While the world burned around them, the war machines herded throngs of witches, cult demagogues, and miracle makers into fetid mass conveyors. Many of these Chaos Knights bore the serpentine badge of House Lucaris, but numerous other households were present, oathbreakers, both recognized and unknown. Suddenly the warp storms intensified. As Cawl and his advisors turned from the picked captures, their entire fleet was swallowed in a tempest of power. Some ships broke apart, while others simply vanished. On the brink of annihilation, a faint signal broke through. In desperation, Cawl followed it. Mundus Malefica. Circled by a spiral of empiric force, the world of Audax has remained hidden from Mars since its fall centuries ago. The once oil-forged world now serves a hellish pack of Chaos Knights, while deep within the planet, fell technology tears the void apart. A minor forged world of the Soelish subsector, Audax was finally abandoned in 633 of Millennium 41, when greenskins proved unstoppable in their rapacious trawl for resources and slaves. The Orcs eventually moved on, but the servants of the machine god could not spare the assets required to re-establish their presence on the planet, as attacks by other Xenos and the great enemy had intensified elsewhere over the decades. So far as the tech priests knew, the Audax system lay in ruins, its forges cold and its temples untended. Mars heard occasional rumours from soulish void-riggers of ever-increasing numbers of raised worlds in the sector, but these ceased when the Great Rift tore its way across the galaxy, and the immense warp anomaly of the Siren Storm ruptured into existence. Had the Adeptus Mechanicus known what truly transpired upon Audax and understood the nature of the Siren Storm, nothing would have held back the machine god's wrath. In truth, the Audax system had fallen under the heel of Chaos Knights and a cabal of demon splicers from the Dark Mechanicum, traitor tech priests who were a dark mirror to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Driven by their desire for the techno-arcana generously sequestered by the Adeptus Mechanicus, the demon splicers had approached Magnate Wersk, a fallen noble of House Lucaris, fueled by hatred for Terra and an obsession to see his house raised to its rightful place of dominance. If the claims they made to Wersk held true, such artifacts would soon be within his gift to bestow. Wersk did not know if the fallen tech priests could be trusted, and he laid layers of contingency in place for their termination. Yet if even half their claims were manifested, House Lucaris could hold immense power in its gauntlet. Fear would swell and ripen in the Imperium, and the fanged knights of House Lucaris would wield fear better than any. On Audax the heretics used warp-fueled demon engines to drill their way straight through the planet's core. At its heart, they installed corrupt machines, binding demonic essences to them with agonizing runic chains, and fueling their torture with the sacrifices of psychers delivered in their thousands by the Chaos Knights. Along thousands of miles of shield channels, their octagonal lengths inscribed with foul runes, the demons' hatred and pain twisted and pulsed. The eldritch power that was generated acted like a hook on the veil, separating the warp from the material realm. As Audax rotated and orbited its parent star, the spindle of soul stuff span and tightened. Its effects reached out into the immaterium, pulling on the tempest of the Siren Storm, and forcing the breach to rupture further and further. There were worlds in its path, fortress worlds, planetary munition silos, and orbital docking facilities. Billions of lives, and some of the Imperium's greatest southern defences. Yet these were merely collateral damage compared to the true target. The black-hearted tech sorcerers claimed they could twist the warp rift around the Audax system before sending it inexorably towards Terra and the Golden Throne itself. Audax was now a world of tainted industry and feudal horror. Beneath the ruined forged temples of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their dark kins manufactorums and blasphemous ritual sites were buried deep, like poisonous barbs in the planet's crust. Miles-long fissures scattered the blasted landscape, city-sized macro vents along their perimeters belching a vast smog thick with psychic effluvia. Shards of predatory sentience, clouds of corrosive vapor, and spreading pools of toxic witchfire befouled the planet's surface. Above the demon Splicer's domain, the towering keeps and fortifications of Wers and the fallen nobles who attended his court stood proud of the desolation. Wers had drawn to his banner not only Lucaris knights, but also roving dreadblades, bitter warriors bereft of even the honor of a household. By far the greatest of the citadels was the Keysberg, a series of ringed fortifications dozens of miles across, built through the artifice of Wersk's idolaters and by the back-breaking labor of enslaved warriors. Its labyrinthine ways hid all manner of mechanized traps. The Keysberg Central Keep guarded one end of the titanic borehole that ran straight through the pant, its battlements bristling with weapon emplacements and profane icons. On the other side of the world, the cowled demon splicers had raised an enormous pyramidal resonator spire that magnified the trapped demon's psychic howls of rage. Stolen Imperial technology, monolith in size and dating back millennia, had been subverted and grafted into a morass of blood-caked antennae, emitters and fleshy protuberances, and a congeries of sentience throbbed throughout it. It was the leaking emotions from this resonator spire, entwined with ancient Imperial signia forms, which Dominus Crawl's reclamation fleet had intercepted. 4 of his third-tier astropaths had died in agony at its touch, but their sacrifice leached away the demonic taint. What remained was undeniably Imperial in origin, but saturated with hues, tastes, and sensations that were ancient and unsettling. The other tech priests who thronged the flagship's bridge had blurted concerns about the signal, but only Cawl had received the astropath's full analysis. The tech priest Dominus knew exactly what the signal represented, and disclosed this knowledge to his trusted advisors who shared his wider ambitions. Whatever was on Ord Tharg was saturated in psychic power. At the thought, a recurrent loop of hate arose once more in Crawl's subroutines, unsolvable, illogical, changeable. Vile. There would be casualties. His plan would imperil the ancient and holy knight suits. But the Omnissiah was with him, he told himself. The Omnissiah and the valiant device. Technis obligatus. Tech priest Dominus Cawl had finally maneuvered his plans towards fruition and was poised to unleash a terrible technology upon the warped foulness within the Keysberg. As Crawl's reclamation fleet approached the source of the psychic signal, the tech priest Dominus revealed his plans to his fellow magi. Audax Tharg, he told them, was tainted by defilers of the machine god's work. The Red Planet had an obligation to defend technology's primacy in the face of corruption. But just as the galaxy was riven with warp storms, so was the Adeptus Mechanicus fractured at its core. Secretive subcults divided the priesthood of Mars, each with their own interpretation of the Great Rift's aftermath. Cawl and his advisors belonged to the hidden sect known as the Teeth of the Cog, which abhorred every form of psychic power as a dire threat to the Adeptus Mechanicus. From astropaths and navigators to the battle psychers of the Adeptus Astartes, none were above the cult's revulsion. They kept this absolutism secret, however. Many on Mars jealously guarded the contracts of exotic fabrication they held with the Imperium's psychic institutions. Thus Cawl chose his words carefully. Through means he did not divulge to the Magi, the Teeth of the Cog had acquired the valiant device, a complex detonator intended to suppress psychic effects with a powerful null pulse. The device would be unleashed against the traitors, he explained, and its concept proved unambiguously. Its successful deployment would be a triumph of pure logic over ephemeral witchery. After all they had witnessed on the journey from Mars, the Magi's passionless detachment was overridden, replaced by binaric brays for war. Even the lowest battlements of the Keysberg's black outer wall stood twice the height of a knight's suit. Even now, the superstitious Baroness Sorden was leading many of her companions to the surface to strike at the Citadel's southern gatehouse. Angular bastions jutted out, their crenellations thick with weapon arrays, clinging to them like the nests of vast avian predators. Cawl authorized diversionary attacks on the walls to the north and south while he directed a major assault in the west. The Martian cohorts attacked in carefully calculated waves, an algorithm of war that predicted an acceptable margin of victory. Ranks of Skitari marched towards the Keysberg's outer wall, while lines of Scorpius dune riders hovered in traditional patterns behind them. Manacles of battle servitors rolled or ambled forward under every conceivable form of locomotion, autoloaders spooling. As the opening canticle of praise spread amid the faithful, packs of Onega engines fired neutron lasers. The strikes impacted on the Keysberg's flanks, each blinding beam detonating in a blast of disruptive energy. Cawl brought ever more esoteric weapons to bear. Crackling lances of power and arching spheres of energy battered the defenses until they cracked. Sizzling spheres of phosphor found their way into the ruptures, causing the very rockcrete to ignite. The Keysberg itself had responded violently the instant Crawl's forces were within range. Multiple heavy weapon mounts located under the battlements fired streams of solid shot, explosive shells and searing laser fire. Servitors and Skitari exploded in showers of bloody components or fell with fist-sized holes burned through their bodies. Maniples of Castellan robots advanced to the wall's foot, before single-mindedly ramming their fists into it, mechanically tearing the defences apart piece by piece, until the section of war finally crumbled. Cawl pushed his warriors swiftly through the breach, the valiant device borne before him on a floating bier, shielded by conversion fields. Iron Strider engines picked their way through, while Archaeota fusiliers glided overhead, unleashing payloads of seismic munitions that undermined walls and disrupted defences. Now the Chaos Knights unleashed their ire, and the invaders discovered the Citadel's true potential. With every courtyard the disciples of the machine gun breached, the traitors and their fortresses tore more of the attackers apart. The deeper Crawl's forces pushed, the higher the curtain walls became, smothering them in a deepening twilight. From titanic embrasures, Chaos Knights shot rapid-fire battle cannons, laser destructors and volcano lances, sizing apart mechanized frames faster than sanctified auto-simulacra could repair them. Sections of the curtain walls ground apart or closed together, to the clanking of hidden cogs, exposing the Martian forces or cutting them off from each other. From the battlements, fierce gargoyles and immense heraldic beast forms vomited caustic fire or came alive to sweep warriors over causeways with clawed limbs of stone. From hidden postern gates, more Chaos Knights lunged, crushing knots of Skitari underfoot before unleashing titanic salvos of firepower on the move. Some loosed furies of explosive missiles and rockets at point-blank range, seemingly relishing the backlash of fire and carnage that flowed over them. In an outer courtyard, a huge iron grid was lifted from the ground by thick chains, and from within the fortress's bowels burst a rabid and visceral knight. As its steps quickened, saw blades set in the soles of its feet whined and sparked. Carbine slugs from Skitari Vanguard burned up in the giant machine's red-tinged iron shield, while heavier fire from Scorpius disintegrators only fueled its berserk onslaught. Combat walkers and battle tanks were crushed and torn, and dozens of Mars's warriors were shredded in fountains of bloody oil. Dominus Cawl became desperate. His isolated forces were being picked apart, and scattered victories could not be capitalized on. Time had run out to get the valiant device to the prime location. With his most capable battle maniple, Cawl fought his way back to the outer wall breach, leaving the device guarded by his remaining servitors, chanting a final prayer. He sent a remote signal. The device activated. The valiant device. Not even Dominus Cawl was certain of where the artifact known as the valiant device had come from, nor would he ever admit that he did not fully understand its function or effects. The teeth of the cog had been approached by an unknown tech priest. How this nameless Magos had divined the subcult's existence was disturbing, but he spoke of bonds of shared knowledge with those he represented. He divulged no noospheric data, however, claiming through a voximeter that he protected the identity of his masters. Minute insectile servitors scurried amongst his robes as he congratulated the teeth of the cog for their insight into the corruptive influence of psychic power, and the need to stamp it out for the good of the Imperium and the galaxy. The secretive Magos told of how an explorator fleet in his Forge World sector had uncovered the ancient core of an STC for a defensive mechanism. His master had unravelled its secrets and built the device, but they needed a suitable testing ground and like-minded devotees to the Imperium's future. As large as a battle servitor, the device's housing lay on an anti-grav bier. The shadowy tech priest explained how it could extinguish the taint of sorcery, releasing a pulse of null energy to throw off the warp's grasping hold on human minds. Thus the monstrous denizens of the Immaterium would be banished forever, and the Adeptus Mechanicus would be fated for saving the Imperium. When the teeth of the cog pressed their guest on the origin of the device, he gave a static-laced bark of laughter and said it might as well have come from the gates of Val. Quarantined for millennia, that haunted region had become a byword for ineffable knowledge and undefinable constants, but the teeth of the cog were too awestruck by the offered device to denounce this impropriety. Beacon of Corruption. Seeking to silence the unholy resonator spire, Imperial Knights of the Parda March vowed to rip its foul root out of Audax Tharg's crust. The servants of the Dark Gods were loath to see Magnate Wesk's endeavour cut short, however, and strained the veil-shielding real space in their hunger to tear the Imperial Knights down. Taking his first stride upon the surface of Audax Tharg, Sir Dekar of House Terrin felt the rumble of underground tremors through Drakefire's limbs. The honoured knight-errants responded smoothly to Sir Dekar's control as they joined the other knights of the Burning Spear. The lance formed to topple the resonator spire. Sir Dekar had pledged to Baroness Sorden that he would see that structure burn to ash, and never had he failed to keep a vow. The resonator spire was the source of the signal the reclamation fleet had followed in its desperation to escape the warp storms, and Cawl had informed Sorden that it mirrored the position of the traitor fastness in Audax Tharg's northern hemisphere. While the Baroness led the majority of the Parda March to tear open the black citadel of the Keysberg, she was determined to ensure that whatever fell power dwelt there could not somehow survive on the planet's far side. Sorden had shared the visions of her seers with her nobles. She had interpreted their tales of a two-headed serpent as a reference to the twin evils of the Keysberg and the resonator spire, and requested her nobles to forego fighting alongside her in order to secure the spire's destruction. Sir Dekar, Lady Olwyn, and Sir Geheris proclaimed their acceptance of the quest, alongside young nobles piloting homagers and the free-blade Sir Morgant of Torres III. It was Sir Geheris who first laid eyes on the construct. An obelisk festooned with branching brass aerials and snaking conduits, it stood half as tall again as his knight valiant, Felbane. Cuneiform markings were intricately incised upon its surfaces, and amongst the mass of spars and cables lengths of fleshy tumours pulsed. Steaming blood matted its surfaces and pooled at the base, staining it in browns and reds, while a buzzing cloud of flies surrounded it. Omnipresent earthquakes ground through the fractured terrain. Chasms, cracks, and fumaroles radiated outwards from the resonator spire. Their sides were encrusted with foul growths, and from within came the putrid emanations of the dark Mechanicum's hidden forges, tainted with psychic runoff. Discarded mistakes or escapees crawled in the depths of each opening, or haunted them as splintered shades stripped down to predatory sentiences. Sickly-coloured fumes twisted into shapes suggestive of fanged maws, while streams of toxic fluids burned and warped anything they touched. With each fissure the knights passed, metallic growls and waft of scrambled code littered their voxnet. Before the burning spear reached the resonator spire, Lady Olwyn and her aggressive knight paladin, Honor Adamantus, alerted the lance to a patch of sky above their target's pinnacle. A bulge of sickly light swam there, spinning and darkening. Then the air all around the construct swiftly condensed into a vapour the colour of bile, with shadows moving within it. Reacting to the knight's proximity, the shadows in the mist pulled themselves from its embrace, their diffused forms cohering into clawed and horned demons. The ground shook as the fissures surrounding the resonator spire appeared to roar in welcome, belching dark fumes and multicoloured flames. The nobles of the burning spear beheld the creatures in horror and outrage. Never had they faced such unholy evil. Memories surfaced of terror struck down by saints in imperial scripture. Warnings bled into their minds from the imprinted spirits from within their throne's Mechanicum, as former pilots relived the hunts of old night. The nobles realized the vile depths to which Audax Darg's masters had sunk, and hatred filled them. Sedekar led them in the lay of the hunt, and ordered the Hellspawn destroyed. The knights unleashed a thunderous opening salvo. Dozens of demons disappeared into the conflagration, and many more were ripped to pieces that dissipated in sulphurous wisps. With Sedekar and Lady Olwyn at their fore, the knights strode towards the resonator spire. More demons eagerly forced their way through the breach around the spire, and warp-spawned hosts almost manifested to the knights' flanks. Sir Morgant urged the last forward, as his knight paladin scions of Torres became wreathed in a corposant of witchcraft. A diseased mass of plague-bearers tore at his armour. Layers of hyperdense alloy blistered and corroded beneath the demon's corrupting blades, and the knight was soon lost to the others. The fumes swallowed him as the roar of his weapons receded. Nearing the spire, Drakefire raised its thermal cannon and fired. The sudden jolt of an enormous earth tremor saw its superheated beam go wide. Streaking missiles from Felbane hit the obelisk, tearing chunks from it and raising howls from the demons. Sir Gaheris cheered as he saw the bulging patch of sky dim, some demons denaturing. Yet the knights were not causing enough damage, and they were being surrounded. Sedekar bade those around him to hold the demons back and carve a route for him as he made for the spire. But regardless of how many they felled, their company continued to shrink. From the chasms clambered mechanical horrors possessed with demonic hunger. With a huge iron claw, one grabbed for an armature Helverin, whose autocannons were tearing apart a sweep of burning chariots. The young noble's knight fell and was dragged kicking down into the pit. Honor Adamantus was charged by a towering winged beast, its fur dripping with blood. Deflecting axe strikes of enormous strength, Lady Olwyn duelled savagely with the bloodthirster. A scything blow ripped open her chassis, missing her mortal frame by inches, but in return she plunged her Reaper chainsword into the monster and drove the weapon up into its head. The shout of victory from her ichor-sprayed throne was short-lived, as furies dove into the knight's open chassis and tore Lady Olwyn apart. Felbane, meanwhile, was surrounded, its cannon switching from target to target to keep the encroaching horrors at bay. Drakenfire reached the Desonator spire just as the lithe apparition stalked from behind it. A blindingly fast whip of sinew struck out, only just stopped by Drakefire's ion shield, before a long blade and dread claws precisely carved into linkages and drive systems. Drakefire's thermal cannon hung limply, as Sedekar sought in vain to land a telling blow on his tormentor. From the fumes it had vanished into, the colossal metal form of Scion of Torres suddenly charged. It was barely recognizable, shedding flaking and metal armor with every step. The demon assailing Drakefire was quick enough to turn and strike, burying its claw in the free-blade knight's carapace and impaling Sir Morgant. But it could not withdraw the limb in time. The crippled knight crashed into the demon and bore it to the ground, pinning the creature down. Sir Morgant's sacrifice had brought Drakefire a reprieve. Drive systems for testing. Sedekar drove the knight-errant's thunderstrike gauntlet into the resonator spire and tore out whatever bloody devices powered it. The bulging warp saw above the spire imploded, and an aftershock whipped across the battlefield, ripping the demons out of existence. A sheet of energy flashed heavenward, and the spire collapsed in a clamour of screaming metal and tearing flesh. Honour and obsession. While Dominus Cawl attacked the Keysberg at several points, Baroness Sworden led the Knights of the Baldermort into a frontal attack on its gatehouse. Her increasingly voluble seers had seen portents of witchcraft and the covenants of the damned. The gallantry of House Terran would, she vowed, see the Chaos Knights destroyed. From orbit, Baroness Sorden of House Terran had likened the Keysberg to a swelling infection, seeing it rendered in the glow of a hollow projection. The ships of the Baldermort had survived the ferocious warp storms around Audax and maintained a wide orbit of the planet away from the ships of Dominus Crawl's reclamation fleet. The tech priest had provided the information Sorden had desperately sought, confirmation of her seer's prophecies. Their reading of the Emperor's Tarot had repeatedly dealt the spindle, upon which crouches the witch, tormenting the fates of the righteous. Cawl confirmed that the signal his fleet had received was indeed befouled with warpcraft. Sorden's attack on the Keysberg was brutally direct, but carefully planned. As well as the lance she had sent south to tear down the resonator spire, the Baroness dispatched 3 full lances of proud nobles to bastions that surrounded her point of attack. In this way, she aimed to ensure that no traitors could attack their forces from the rear. For her main thrust, Baroness Sorden led a cavalcade of 3 lances straight towards the Keysberg's primary armoured gatehouse, a mile from where Dominus Crawl's forces attacked the walls. 24 other knights of all classes strode with their liege. More than half were scions of House Terran, but the houses of Oberon, Griffith, and Fireheim all flew the pennants of their distant kin with pride. Ensconced upon the throne mechanism of the Night Warden, Bright Destroyer, Baroness Sorden led all 3 lances in a closely packed wedge. Already, defensive fire was reaching them, glancing from pauldrons and ion shields. Knights with long-range weapons moved at the fore and flanks, and their weapons roared in response. Battle cannon shells and storm spear rockets streaked towards the battlements, while siege-breaker cannons pummeled the bastion's energy shields. Armiger Helverins targeted the Keysberg's weapon sconces, blinding their sensors with squalls of interference. Shielded in the formation's midst, stomped knights valiant and gallant, close-ranged brawlers that no fortress wall can withstand once they have been reached. Coordinating their iron shields in defense, the knights advanced up the gatehouse's incline avenue, past grisly trophies. When those on the edges of the formation suffered damage, they moved back, their places taken by another as the firepower pouring down on them increased with every step they took. The gatehouse's shield finally overloaded from the Imperial Knights' relentless attacks and expired in a sheet of ejected flame. Now Knight Castellans moved to the fore. Ancient weapons sent out the burning heat of stars, and eruptions of fire and liquid rock burst from the wall. The formation reached the gatehouse, whose black walls rose to 3 times the knight's height, and a trio of knights valiant sent their thunder coil harpoons slamming into the Cyclopean masonry. The power fed along their chains fried the gatehouse's remaining defences. Then the weapons were winched back in, anchored by the weight of the knights wielding them, and the colossal walls crumpled and fell. The breach was made, and knights from the formation's centre charged through it, smashing aside any remaining obstacles with thunderous blows from their huge gauntlets. 3 knights perished as they fought their way through the gatehouse's cathedral-sized interior. Streamers of caustic chemicals poured from murder holes, metal spars shot from hidden graphitic rails, and prehensile technovirus injectors coiled from the shadows. The Keysberg's maze of courtyards constantly changed to the clank and grind of hidden machinery. When the Baldermort emerged into the first of them, the citadel's true scale hit Baroness Sorden, but she could not stop now. At that moment, the Chaos Knights fell upon the invaders in surge of ground-shaking hatred. Dozens of warped engines, their malformed carapaces thick with spikes, with spines and leering faces, emerged from hidden transitways or attacked from rotating embrasures. The planet's tectonic activity was drowned out by the shuddering impacts of tons of metal crashing into each other, roars from emitter grills, and the blast of immense weaponry. Reaper chainswords sheared off weapon mounts as gauntlets smashed and tore through armoured cowlings. At close range, the traitors' greater numbers began to tell, as did the superior mobility afforded by the Keysberg's hidden ways. Baroness Sorden lashed out in frustration and rising despair, but she could not ignore the mounting losses. She yearned to take as many enemies with her as possible, yet she was reasonable with her fellow knights. Filled with anger, she called the retreat. As the part of March began to withdraw to their initial breach, Sorden vainly tried to raise Dominus Cawl by Vox. Chaos Knights hounded them, crippling with Gatling cannons and laser destructors, pulling down any who were too slow. To the west, Sorden saw the remnants of the Adeptus Mechanicus streaming back across the cracked plain, their own battle clearly lost as well. Suddenly an explosion erupted from where the Omnissire's servants had been fighting. An expanding shell of energy enveloped the Keysberg and raced towards all three forces. The null field caught the retreating Scutari servitors first. Many slowed and then simply stopped, arms limp, but those clustered around data tethers appeared to fare better. The knights of both sides suffered more grievously. Within their thrones Mechanicum, imprinted Geists screamed as they were stripped away, the feedback slaying their nobles. Several knights collapsed, their pilots' souls engulfed in cascades of entropy. Almost as quickly as it had struck, the null field dissipated, and the remaining Imperial Knights managed to outpace their reeling pursuers. Sorden praised the Emperor that the Parda March had weathered the explosion better than the traitors, though she could not explain how. Intercepting Dominus Cawl to demand answers, she found the tech piece rambling about a device, his triumph, acceptable losses. At first, Sorden thought Cawl afflicted, then realized the death of her companions had been his doing. Her gauntlet snatched him up, crushing the massive bionic limbs beneath his torso. As she bore him back to the knight's landing barges, she ignored his screams and the paltry fire of his Scutari. Demon Surge. As Sorden returned to her ship, the demonic essence bound within Audax Darg's core felt the effects of the valiant device. Its prematurely activated null field had disrupted the shackles that tormented them. Fueled by thoughts of vengeance and bloodlust, they broke free, surging to the surface with an almighty roar. The effects of the valiant device had penetrated Audax Darg's surface and shattered the wards binding the demonic essences within the planet's core. Centuries of torment were visited back upon the demon splices 1,000-fold, as four surviving entities ripped apart the heretics and their dreadful machinery. Yet there was one these exalted demons loathed above all others, he who had presided over their prison, Magnate Wesk. As vortices of energy, the four warp-spawned essences tore their way to the surface in an orgy of violent power. The lingering effects of the valiant device saturated the ground. Most demons would have found such psychic fallout intolerable, but these Lords of Ruin were mighty indeed. Worshipped as fell deities by some, they had enslaved empires and corrupted entire subsectors. As Wesk regrouped his shattered court, the demons pounced on his knight despoiler, Corifex. They sank into its chassis, welding energy vent and hatch shut with infernal fire. Wesk screamed in horror as the essences possessed the throne mechanism he was linked to, tearing out the imprinted spirits and casting them into the warp. Corifex's structure mutated, piercing its master with iron shards. Wesk desperately pleaded with the demons, offering them the service of his court. Cackling peals of laughter poured into his skull in response, as a blemish in the air between Corifex and the Chaos Knights of his court swelled into a bottomless vortex. One by one, the traitor war engines were dragged into it, taking their fallen nobles with them. The four demonic essences were not yet done with this world. They beheld the rising flares of mass conveyors returning to high orbit, and tracked the trail of null energy back to the Adeptus Mechanicus ships. The most far-sighted of the essences told its brothers that more of the fearsome devices would appear if they ignored these mortals, and with a thought the creatures sped towards the Martian vessels, a call of summons rippling through the warp as they went. The remaining Adeptus Mechanicus ships of Crawl's reclamation fleet were in uproar. The Magos had dumped an energy data packet into their data core containing his observations of the device's effects, but it came with the revelation of his abduction by Baroness Sorden. When warp breaches appeared on the decks of each ship, therefore, the remaining Scutari clades were already on a war footing. The vast hangar bay of Crawl's flagship, the Regulus Prime, stretched for a mile along its spine. There Vanguard and Ranger squads waited in rigid delineated areas, as hundreds of servitors made ready assault craft to reclaim their Magos from the Knights. But without warning, 8 spatial anomalies burst into being within the hangar, and from their eternal depth crawled gangling creatures of changing hues, their skin alight with unnatural fire. Searing bolts of flame lashed out at witless servitors as canisters of promethium exploded in pink-tinged fireballs. The Skitarii Alphas requested doctrines from the bridge as demons flooded the enormous hangar and fires raged uncontrollably. In the cavernous ceiling space, soaring razor-edged demons and squads of Taraxi hunted each other amongst the forests of gantries and macrocanes. In the bowels of Regulus Prime, the bloated Magos Jabek fiercely organized the defense of the Enginarium. Permanently sealed into a gargantuan suspended platform from which he controlled everything in his domain, the Magos sent gangs of indentured laborers to shield his precarious generatoria, Gellerfield housings and power couplings from the filth-encrusted creatures spewing from the warp breaches. To Magos Jabek's horror and disgust, several of the work gangs defending the Gellerfield had sprouted biomechanical appendages, seeping with brackish filth, and now toward the machinery's housing with rasping claws. Smoking brass blades effortlessly severed Jabek's Cataphron retinue into pieces before a bestial winged shadow dropped down with a roar upon the Magos' exposed platform. The desperate Magoi on the breach futilely attempted to collate similar reports from each of their ships. Hundreds of localized warp breaches had materialized throughout the fleet. The creatures defying categorization were emerging in droves to revel in blood-fueled slaughter. The bridge's arched gateway was sealed, but a purple-hued breach manifested in the center of the control dais. From it leapt blurred shapes, pale and barbed, which eviscerated the hardwired command crew in a matter of moments. Binaric bursts for aid squalled in unison, then expired. The master of this demonic horse languidly approached the shipmaster and drove its long talons through his body, feeding its essence into the ship's navigational controls. Couched in the Regulus Prime's command protocols, an order bled outwards to the other ships. As one, the Adeptus Mechanicus fleet turned and powered towards the fiery heart of the system's star.